Hi everybody, Rob Mize with you once again, and I was feeling a bit nostalgic and I got out my old After Effects scrapbook and I thought maybe this could be a good tutorial. It's a great way to introduce pictures, graphics, and even video into your presentations. So if you're ready, let's get started. I have my graphics here. I'll choose this one and drag it into my Create New Comp button and use Command K to bring up my comp settings, change the name to Scrapbook, and I'll bring this down to 40%, turn on my title action grid, and drag it over just off center because I'm going to use my shape tool and create a rectangle just off center once again, but vertically centered. And I'll change the name of that to Front Page 1 and drag it underneath my graphic. Choose my ellipse tool on that same shape layer and I'll draw a small ellipse and select that ellipse path and use Command D, and now I have two ellipses as part of that same shape. I'll drag that second ellipse path down and maybe make that a little smaller. There we go. I'll change both of those so they're the same. Now I could use a mask to make these into holes, but I'm going to use a merge path operator and do the same thing. If I change that to subtract, not quite what I want, but if I drag those ellipses under the rectangles, then suddenly as a merge path, those parts of the path are subtracted. I'll add a bevel alpha effect, and I need some more of these holes, so I'll use a repeater operator, drag it above the merge path operator. Here you see that the order of these layers really matters. I'll bring that rectangle under the repeater and change the merge path mode to exclude intersections, so you can see that where those intersections occur, that part of the shape is excluded. Let's change this repeater copies to 6 and reposition the x-axis to 0 and bring the y-axis down so that our copies are spread along that y-axis. I'll turn our graphic back on. Let's make both of these 3D layers. Parent the graphic to our front page and hit R to reveal the rotation parameters. Add a Y rotation keyframe. Come forward about 2 seconds and then bring that over to 180 degrees, and there's your first page turn. Now this is, in my mind, the front part of the first page. So I'm going to duplicate both of these, and now I'll rename this to Back Page 1 and drag it underneath the original, and I'll bring this duplicate graphic down to the bottom of our stack. So these are, in my mind, in the same sort of order that they really would be. Parent the back page and the other graphic to the front page so that everything is controlled by the front page. If we look at this in the custom view, we can get a sense of where these layers are in Z-space. Let's select them all and hit P to reveal the position parameters. And we see that we can move those forward or backward, in front of or behind the other elements. I want this just 1 pixel in front of the front page. The back page I want separated by about 3 pixels just to give a sense of thickness to the page. And the back graphic, let's separate that from the front page by 4 pixels. Now as we look at that, we see that we've got a Y rotation on that back page that we don't need. So we'll just let the front page take care of that rotation and get rid of those keyframes. Let's replace this back graphic by selecting it, and then choose AE Tornado in this case, and we'll just drag that down, and it takes the place of the previous graphic. Let's flip that horizontally by just making that value minus. You could also go transform, flip horizontal, and it would do the same thing. You just make the X scale value minus. I'm going to make all these one color except the front page, which is our control layer. I'll leave that yellow. I'll select them all and duplicate them and drag the duplicates to the top of our stack. Deselect that one yellow layer and change them to, in this case, pink. Let's select our top graphic, choose a replacement, and Alt drag it into place. And our back graphic, select it, choose a replacement, and Alt drag it into place. And if we just look at those layers, we see that now we have page 2. Let's select those, duplicate them, drag them to the top. You'll notice that After Effects also parents those for you and names that front page and back page for you, so you keep track of that. Once again, we'll select our layer, Alt drag a replacement in there, and do the same for our back layer graphic on page 3. Now if we have all these layers visible, we aren't seeing them all because they are all in the same Z-space, and we need to separate them. So let's look at our yellow or our control layers. Hit P to reveal that position parameter. And let's think of page 3 as being our reference in 0 space. So let's move the front page 2 5 frames forward and the front page 1 10 frames forward to move it and all its parented layers forward that many pixels. Now let's take our rotation layers for layer 2 and 3 and separate those so that our pages will turn consecutively. 1, 2, and 3. By looking at our front layers, front pages, our control pages, hit P to reveal the position parameters, and let's add a keyframe for each one of those. We've already placed those. Let's line up our position keyframes with the rotation. And let's look at this after our pages have turned. And we see that the order of the pages has not changed as it should. In other words, page 1 should now be at the bottom. So let's change that to 0. Page 2 should remain where it is in the middle of our stack at a value of -5. Page 3 should now be on top at a value of -10. I'll take all these, make them easy ease keyframes, and I'll move them forward so that our page turn starts at about the 2-second mark. Now let's put a background behind our scrapbook. I have a graphic I got from cgtextures.com. I'll make it 3D, move it back about 30 pixels. Let's add a new light. I like spotlights because you can get kind of a vignette effect with those, and I like the way you can direct them. And let's select all of our layers and hit AA, and let's leave the material options just where they are. Let's come down to our front page control layers and change those values to cast shadows on. we're going to let those layers do all the work as far as casting the shadows. There's no sense in everything casting a shadow. However, these shadows are cumulative. That is, as you get additional pages piled on each other, the shadow gets darker, and I don't want that. So I'm going to come here to page 2, add an opacity keyframe, pull it forward, and add another one with a value of 0, so that the opacity, just as the page starts to turn, goes from 0 to 100%, with it achieving 100% at the point where that page is revealed. So as page 1 turns and reveals page 2, page 2 will increase from 0 to 100%. That way you don't have those shadows piling up on each other when the scrapbook is closed in either direction. So we'll do that for the subsequent pages, page 3. Actually, I'll just copy and paste those opacity keyframes. But we'll also adjust the opacity so that it fades out as page 2 comes on top of page 1. Look at these project files, and I hope that will make sense to you. I'm just avoiding these shadow layers piling up on each other and making the shadow darker, darker, and darker. Now let's work on our rings for our binder. With no layer selected, I'll select my rectangle tool and draw a small rectangle which will create a new shape layer. I'm going to open up the parameters on that, open up transform, and change that position on the x-axis to 0, and unlink the size values and change that x value to make it larger than the composition. I want it to run off the sides so that when we add a perspective CC cylinder effect, we get those rings created without the edge that would be on our stroke border. So I'll reduce this radius down to about 15, I think. And once again, let's add a repeater operator to this shape. And let's transform the position, change the X position to 0, and let's bring the Y position down. We need some additional copies there. Let's change that to 6. Adjust accordingly. And let's make this a 3D layer. Even though this CC cylinder effect is a 3D effect, you see that if we change the position, it doesn't interact. But if we make that shape layer a 3D layer, now as we change its position in Z-space, it does interact with the shape layers. However, the top and bottom do not interact independently. So I'm just going to call this rings top here. And we'll just render the outside, so that we're just rendering here the top of our rings. Make some slight adjustments there. And you can see as our page turns that its position is relative to that of the rings. And it obscures and is obscured by the rings as you would expect it to be. So it looks like the holes in the page are actually turning across the rings of the notebook. And I'm going to come up here to rings and add, of course, the bevel alpha effect. I think it does just kind of give it a shape and a shine to it. Now that looks fine as long as you are staying in this position. But if you intend to create a camera and move around a little bit, you may have some problems. Let's take a look at this. If we create a new camera and hit C to bring up your camera tools, rotate through those, And as we move around on this camera, we see the rings begin to do strange things. And this is not what we want. So the best solution for me on this particular project was to make this back into a 2D layer and to pre-comp it using Command-Shift-C. And I'll call this pre-comp rings top, and move the attributes into the new composition. Make the pre-comp a 3D layer. And now with those position parameters, position it where you want in 3D space. And once you have it positioned where you want it, it will react with the other layers as it did before. There are limitations to this. If you rotate the camera to extreme angles, then the rings will go flat. And so you may have to come up with another solution. There are other ways to do this, but that would make this tutorial run even more painfully long. And if I want to create the bottom of those rings, I can't just duplicate this layer, because this and the duplicate would share the same pre-comp layer. And that won't work in this case. So we will duplicate not the layer, but the actual pre-comp source. And open that up and go to our rings layer and change that to inside. And back to our scrapbook composition. Make that a 3D layer and position it accordingly. So we turn our light back on. We have our shadows, our rings, and our 3-page scrapbook. Of course, you can make this as many pages as you want, and you can pre-comp these pages. Now, if you want a cover layer, that's simply a matter of some other elements taking the place of that graphic. If we look at those elements, you can see we have the back graphic from the front cover, the back part of the cover, the front part of the cover, and then 2 text layers, and then the After Effects logo. And that makes up our cover page for our scrapbook. Again, these are positioned in Z space with a bit of separation so that the elements don't interfere with one another as they rotate. And if you do get that sort of interference, just increase that Z space separation a little bit. Back here at our scrapbook composition, you'll remember that we added transparency keyframes. And since we did that, there is really no reason for us to render these other graphics and their shadows when we don't need them. So what I've done is, using the opacity keyframes as a guide, I've selected those layers that are part of that page and trim the start and end points of those layers using the Alt-left bracket and Alt-right bracket keys. Now, if I were doing this from a different angle and I needed to see those layers stacked on top of one another, I couldn't do it this way. But for this project, with the camera position that I have, I can get away with trimming these and not having to worry about the impact on my render. Now, when you get the project files, you're going to see color bars where all these graphics are listed, because I can't give you these graphics. But you can replace those easily enough using the same Alt-drag technique that I showed you. And you can also just right-click on any of the graphics in the source file and replace those with graphics or video of your own. So there you have it. I hope you found this project to be useful and that it has some techniques that you can put to work in your projects. I appreciate hearing from you and seeing what you're working on. So until next time, this is Rod Mize. Thanks for watching and happy compositing.